as he stares towards the sea beyond the moonlit bay, at a sunset where once he was free from the heartbreak of this day, as he dreams of the freedom there beyond the blood-stained chain, where a slave whose only prayer is to touch his sunset once again.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Why do you steal? It is asked of him. Why not? He replies. You have, I do not. When you are me, I will ask of you, why do you steal? How then, he says, will you reply?
As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
So here and now he prays, while the mist of uncertainty gathers. He kneels in innocence, yet his fear stays. In his mind he sees no recompense for the loss of all that matters. In the coming years and days, he will dream of the freedom there, beyond the blood-stained chain, where a slave whose only prayer was to touch his sunset once again.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
When you are me, I will ask of you, why do you steal? How then will you reply?
When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
We're a slave whose only prayer is to touch his sunset once again. Martin Luther King was for me one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929, he decided to become a Baptist minister, and he was one of the most respected leaders of the civil rights movement in America. He preached nonviolence and followed the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. He fought against the Jim Crow laws of segregation in the southern states of America. He worked tirelessly all his life for equal rights for all minorities who are being oppressed in his country. On August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, before 250,000 people, he gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." In 1964, Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. On the night of the 3rd of April 1968, he gave his speech, "I Have Been to the Mountain Top." And sadly, the next day, he was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. The world and America lost a beautiful man of peace. I'm John Veasays. Thank you for listening to my podcast, I Have a Dream. And please spend some time reading about Dr. Martin Luther King.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world of which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
My tears mix with the bitter falling rain. So long walking this rough and dusty road. The wrong boots, the wrong shirt, the wrong God, the wrong colour skin. On this path of fallen martyrs, lashed by words of hatred and pain. I'm near now to the rising sunset. I'm free at last. I can break this rusty chain that has cut my neck for so many, many years. So here I can soon lay down and rest under the warmth of shared love. No longer a man against the world, or a fallen petal dying in the gutter, stepped on by soft words of regret. So as the early morning dew dries under sparkling sunlight, at dawn's mist, I hear the voices of those we must never, ever forget.
I'm only going to talk to you just for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. So I ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family, Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. but more importantly to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to improve the quality of our life and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people.
So as the early morning dew dries under sparkling sunlight, at dawn's mist, I hear the voices of those we must never, ever forget.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.